Welcome.
You okay?
Yeah, okay. I was just like, something's weird with the sound, but now welcome to another episode of Lit with Lenin. How are you doing, Janet?
I'm doing pretty good. Doing pretty good. It's went from 90 degrees for like 2 to 3 days to like it's like in the 50s, 60s, and like low
Okay.
60s.
It's still like 10 degrees Celsius here, and I still need a space heater, and my apartment's bloody cold.
Yeah. No, it was just weird because it got like so cold, so it was like you were like super hot for 2 days, and then now I'm like freezing my butt off. But you know, so I live in New England. What do you want?
So Matt is gonna come soon, I guess. Let's see. What is going? Let me just. Oh, there are good some people watching. That's good. That are not us. Is this time we're trying out? And hello Wade Pilgrim and Techloid Tech. Is this a better time for people? Let us know in the comments or like say something. We're experimenting with going a little bit later to see if we get more, if it's better for people or not. Lots of interesting things happened in Twitter, but for me, the most interesting thing is the lady who runs the Mueller She Wrote podcast got exposed by an anonymous account for having stolen valor. So she claimed that she was injured as a vet during the first Gulf War. But of course, she was 16 during the first Gulf War and didn't enlist for another 3 years. So that was a big lie.
Wow, I didn't even catch any of this. I didn't even know. No.
Yeah. Wow. So basically, and then she claimed that she got fired from her job at the VA because Trump personally intervened, but that's not what happened. She tried to take when she was like doing her tour for Mueller, she wrote. She tried to like take time off from the VA, claiming it was PTSD, but then she got caught going on tour and not being sick.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, they all come out. They all fall out. All the grifters always fall out. Like they always
and then she tried to claim it was Russia was behind it, and it's like, come on. I mean, seriously, they just pasted her old tweets where there were inconsistencies. You don't need Russia for that. Just any random person who's irritated by the podcast is able to do that.
But like, I mean, it's the truth. So she was like Russia exposed her.
Allegedly.
But it doesn't matter. It's the truth. Like
exactly. But that's what libs always do. Bobby Kennedy Jr. Wrote a message mildly in support of Roger Waters. And then he deleted it after meeting with Rabbi Shmuley, who's like one of the most notorious anti-Islamic bigots.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's the whole thing. Like you have this guy that, let's bring him in, try to, push him for Biden. But I mean, I'm okay with most of the stuff he's just, to me, he's a Democrat. He's
all over the place.
Yeah. But I don't know. Like, no, I don't trust him. He's just going to be another establishment hack no matter what he does. So, and the fact that he is changing his tune about Israel and no.
Yeah.
Plus, I never ever vote for a Kennedy anyways. Living in Massachusetts, I am anti-Kennedy.
Interesting. Joe Kennedy was really weird when he was running against Markley, and it was funny. He was like, Markley, and then he started doing it on Markley boys, and it's like, bullying works. And it was just like, yep, bullying works, Joe.
Yeah, and I don't even like Markey that much, but
I don't eat. I mean, I'm neutral towards Markey, but he's better than Joe Kennedy.
He's whatever. I mean, to me, he's he's a little bit better on certain things than Warren is, and some things not.
Yeah.
But I mean, whatever. I don't really care. But that was the whole thing. Like, I did not want the milkman. That was his nickname in college because he wouldn't drink. They called him the milkman.
Wait, have I seen called the milkman again?
Joe Kennedy, because he'd order milk at a bar.
Ew, that's gross.
Who orders milk at a bar?
I don't know. Somebody who wants the nickname Milkman.
Mm-hmm. So yeah.
Okay. Let's see. I went to Moscow last week for a conference on political repression. That was interesting. In Ukraine. I'll have the videos out later. I can't think of anything else. So we might as well get started on our piece. I don't have the comments visible. I've accidentally even closed the screen, so I need you to keep the eyes out for that.
Okay, I'll watch that. You're gonna read?
Yeah, right. Why not? Yippers 99. We are talking about RFK Jr. Okay. So let's get started. The piece is Proletarian Revolution and the Renegade Kautsky. And this part is, can there be equality between exploiter and exploited?
Yeah.
So check out the last stream where we did the first two parts. Kautsky argues as follows: the exploiters have always formed only a small minority of the population. Page 14 of Kautsky's pamphlet. This is indisputably true. Taking this as the starting point, what should be the argument? One may argue in a Marxist socialist way, in which case one would proceed from the relation between the exploited and the exploiters. Or one may argue in a liberal bourgeois democratic way, and in that case one would proceed from the relationship between the majority and the minority. If we argue in a Marxist way, we must say the exploiters inevitably transform the state, and we are speaking of democracy, i.e., one of the forms of the state, into an instrument of the rule of their class, the exploiters over the exploited. Hence, as long as there are exploiters who rule the majority, the democratic state must inevitably be a democracy for the exploiters. A state of the exploited must fundamentally differ from such a state. It must be a democracy for the exploited, and a means of suppressing the exploiters, and the suppression of a class means inequality for that class, its exclusion from democracy. And in the US, obviously, it is a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. How many people, like the US prison population is 2 million, they're excluded, but then like people who have a felony are systematically excluded in many states. And of course, we know if we look at historical oppression and racial oppression, we know what race they form.
Yeah, and like you have to have an address to vote. You have to. So I mean, there's a lot of exploited.
Yeah, in last week's episode on historically, Dan and Ben compare how voting was so easy in Nicaragua compared to the U.S. And so it is true that they want to limit the participation, and of course, voting itself should not be the limits of participation of democracy. People need to have constant input on the decision-making process, but even the bare minimum of voting is such a hassle for most.
Can I bring up one thing? Did you see Yipper's comment that Cornel West is running for president?
Yes, Cornel West is running for president in the People's Party. He just announced.
Okay, all right. Yeah, so I was wondering who they were going to try to put up on the People's Party. So,
well, that is much better than what I expected from the People's Party.
Exactly. So, hey, we'll see.
Yeah. If we argue in a liberal way, we must say the majority decides, the minority submits. Those who do not submit are punished. That is all. Nothing need be said about the class character of the state in general or of pure democracy in particular, because it is irrelevant. For a majority is a majority and a minority is a minority. A pound of flesh is a pound of flesh, and that is all there is to it. This is exactly how Kautsky argues. Why should the rule of the proletariat assume and necessarily assume a form which is incompatible with democracy? Then follows a very detailed and very verbose explanation backed by a quotation from Marx and the election figures of the Paris Commune to the effect that the proletariat is in the majority. The conclusion is a regime which is so strongly rooted in the people has not the slightest reason for encroaching upon democracy. It cannot always dispense with violence in cases when violence is employed to suppress democracy. Violence can only be met with violence, but a regime which knows that it has popular backing will employ violence only to protect democracy and not to destroy it. It would be simply suicidal if it attempted to do away with its most reliable basis, universal suffrage, that deep source of mighty moral authority. As you see, the relationship between the exploited and the exploiters has vanished in Kautsky's argument. All that remains is majority in general, minority in general, democracy in general, and pure democracy, which we are already familiar. All this, mark you, is said apropos of the Paris Commune. To make things clearer, I shall quote Marx and Engels to show what they said on the subject of the apropos of the Paris Commune. Marx: when the workers replaced the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie by their revolutionary dictatorship, to break down the resistance of the bourgeoisie, the workers invest the state with a revolutionary and transitional form. Engels: and the victorious party in a revolution must maintain its rule by means of terror which it arms inspire in the reactionaries. Would the Paris Commune have lasted more than a day if it had not used the authority of the armed people against the bourgeoisie? Can we, on the contrary, blame it for having made too little use of that authority? Engels: as therefore the state is only a transitional institution which is used in the struggle in the revolution to hold down one's adversaries by force. It is sheer nonsense to talk of a free people state. So as long as the proletariat still needs a state, but it does not need it in the interest of freedom, but in order to hold down its adversaries, and as soon as it becomes possible to speak of freedom, the state as such shall cease to exist.
Kautsky is just to say, like, that is a very important line there that Engels is saying, like, why they need the state, because that's what the anarchists don't get.
Yeah. So Anarch, for example, was like upset that the Soviet Union didn't dismantle itself in 22 after the Bolshevik Revolution, and it's like, do you not realize the number of reactionary forces who are there to commit and they're not willing to stop at the Holocaust? Like, that is how extreme they're going to go to. Like, they'll commit complete genocide. And people don't realize how bad the reactionary counter-revolution always is.
Yep.
Kautsky is far removed from Marx and Engels as heaven is from earth, as a liberal from a proletarian revolutionary. The pure democracy and simple democracy that Kautsky talks about is merely a paraphrase of the free people's state, i.e., sheer nonsense. Kautsky, with the learned air of a most learned armchair fool, or with the innocent air of a 10-year-old schoolgirl, asks, why do we need a dictatorship when we have a majority? And Marx and Engels explains, to break down the resistance of the bourgeoisie, to inspire reactionaries with fear, to maintain the authority of the armed proletariat against the bourgeoisie, that the proletariat may forcibly hold down its adversaries. Kautsky does not understand these explanations. Infatuated with the purity of democracy, blind to its bourgeoisie character, he consistently urges that the majority, since it is the majority, need not break down the resistance of the minority nor forcibly hold it down. And let's look at what happened to Kautsky's country in about 20 years following this philosophy.
It's absolutely ridiculous. Like, I
mean, obviously, like in 20 years, in 1933, the Social Democratic Party were clapping to Hitler and singing Deutschland, Deutschland über alles. And because the German Republic did not do this, it allowed all the reactionaries to rearm, even against the Treaty of Versailles, where there was like limits on the arms, but then like all sides kind of ignored it, and then we all know the rest, right?
Yes.
But Jacobin, on the other hand, keeps like even today they wrote like this shitty article about why why it's not necessary to abandon the democratic character. And I swear to God, this article has been already debunked by Lenin in the Proletarian Revolution and the Renegade Kautsky.
And it's amazing because this is what, back in 1919 that he wrote this. And I mean, we know all this. They already knew by then it wasn't like having a major majority didn't matter. I mean, you could look at the United States back then. It didn't matter that the workers were the majority. Like, they didn't run the country.
Yeah, I mean, in every other country besides, so back in 1919, the workers will always be the majority, and they don't run in most places. So no. Yeah. Infatuate. Okay. Kautsky does not understand this explanation. Wait, yeah. Infatuated with the purity of democracy, blind to its bourgeoisie character, he consistently urges that the majority, since it is the majority, need not break down the resistance of the minority, nor forcibly hold it down. It is sufficient to suppress cases of infringement of democracy. Infatuated with the purity of democracy, Kautsky inadvertently commits the same little error that all bourgeoisie Democrats always commit. Namely, he takes formal equality, which is nothing but a fraud and hypocrisy under capitalism, for actual equality. Quite a trifle. Exactly. You and I have the same right to sue anyone in a court of law, but obviously Elon Musk can hire teams of lawyers that pay $500 an hour in order to get his every whim fulfilled.
Yeah.
The exploiter and the exploited cannot be equal. This truth, however unpleasant it may be to the Kautsky, nevertheless forms the essence of socialism. Another truth, there can be no real actual equality until all possibility of exploitation of one class by another has been totally destroyed. Absolutely. Because like, as long as you allow the exploited mechanism, the exploiters will always find a way to worm it back. For example, FDR, like all the FDR things that were won were all rolled back, right?
That's why you can't fix capitalism, because the system of capitalism is to have exploited people. So yeah. You can't ever think that you're going to get rid of this whole exploitation under capitalism.
Exploiters can be defeated at one stroke in the event of a successful uprising at the center or a revolt in the army. But except in very rare and special cases, the exploiters cannot be destroyed at one stroke. It is impossible to expropriate all landowners and capitalists of a big country at one stroke. Furthermore, expropriation alone as a legal or political act does not settle the matter by a long chalk. It is necessary to depose the landowners and capitalists in actual fact to replace their management of the factories and estates by different management, workers' management in actual fact. There can be no equality between the exploiters, for who many generations have been better off because of their education, conditions of wealthy life and habits, and the exploited, the majority of whom, even in the most advanced and the most democratic bourgeoisie republics, are downtrodden, backward, ignorant, intimidated, and disunited. Absolutely. And then there's also the network. For example, you have all the Juan Guaidos who can get all the help from the US and whatnot. But what about the illiterate peasant in Congo, or the illiterate child worker in Congo who's going to help them? Like anything, right? Like, so they have this network that even when they lose their power, they can always get armed and come back, right?
Yeah. Oh, did you just... Are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Oh, okay. You just you buzzed a little. Okay.
Okay. And for a long time after the revolution, and exploiters inevitably continue to retain a great number of political advantages. Yep. They still have money, since it is impossible to abolish all money at once. Some movable property, often fairly considerable, and some property in, say, France or Switzerland or the US. They still have various connections and habits of organization and management, knowledge of all the secrets, customs, methods, means, and possibilities of management, superior education, close connection with high technical personnel who live and think like the bourgeoisie, incomparably greater experience in the art of war. This is so very important, and so on and so forth. Yeah. And back then in the Soviet Union, they didn't like the people couldn't even read. So it was just very
yeah.
If the exploiters are defeated in one country only, and this, of course, is typical since a simultaneous revolution in a number of countries is a rare exception, they still remain stronger than the exploited, for the international connections of the exploiters are enormous. Like the national and all the money the National Endowment for Democracy gives them, all, the Guaidos of the world.
I love how they're we're not part of the CIA. Like, what was it, the head lady was coming out saying, like, there's no connection to the CIA. There's none whatsoever. Like, I was watching, like, Grey Zone was writing a piece on it, and she was coming back at them, claiming there's never been any connection with the CIA. And it's
but you have a connection with the NED, and it's open. And the
she is like the, I don't know if she was like
I forgot her. I know exactly what you mean.
Yeah. So she's sitting there trying to say, like, we accept money, but we don't know where it comes from. But we
yeah, I'm
but
sure
we're not involved with the CIA.
Yeah. This section of the exploited from the least advanced middle, peasant, artisan, and similar groups of the population may and indeed does follow the exploiters and has been proved by all revolutions, including the Commune. For there were also proletarians among the Versailles troops, which the most learned Kautsky has forgotten. In these circumstances, to assume that in a revolution which is at all profound and serious, the issue is decided simply by the relation between the majority and minority is the acme of stupidity, the silliest prejudice of a common liberal, an attempt to deceive the people by concealing from them a well-established historical truth. This historical truth is that in every profound revolution, the prolonged, stubborn, and desperate resistance of the exploiters, who for a number of years retain important practical advantages over the exploited, is the rule. Never, except in the sentimental fantasies of the sentimental fool Kautsky, will the exploiters submit to the decision of the exploited majority without trying to make use of their advantages in the last desperate battle or the series of battles. And by these series of battles, we mean like the Contras in Nicaragua, where they gouge out like eyes of teenagers and behead people, and you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
The transition from capitalism to communism takes an entire historical epoch. Until this epoch is over, the exploiters inevitably cherish the hope of restoration, and even after, they cherish and they fight for like 30, 40, 50 years. And this hope turns into attempts at restoration. After their first serious defeat, the overthrown exploiters, who had not expected their overthrow, never believed it possible, never conceded the thought of it, throw themselves with energy grown tenfold, with furious passion and hatred grown a tenfold into the battle for the recovery of the paradise of which they were deprived. This is basically all of like victims of communism. On behalf of their families who had been leading such a sweet and easy life, whom now the common herd is condemning to ruin and destitution, or common labor. In the train of capitalist exploiters follow the white sections of the petty bourgeoisie, with regard to whom decades of historical experience of all countries testify that they vacillate and hesitate, one day marching behind the proletariat and the next day taking fright at the difficulties of the revolution, that they become panic-stricken at the first defeat or semi-defeat of the workers, grow nervous, run about aimlessly, snivel, and rush from one camp to another, just like our Mensheviks and social revolutionaries. In these circumstances, when an epoch of desperately acute war, when history presents the question of whether age-old and thousand-year-old privileges are to be or not to be at a time to talk about the majority and minority and pure democracy, about dictatorship being unnecessary, and about equality between the exploiter and the exploited, what infinite stupidity and abysmal philistinism are needed for this? And I see this like basically happening at every color revolution attempt. Like people don't understand how brutal the quote unquote peaceful pro-democracy protesters are, or the class character, and so on, right?
Yeah. Do you want to check to see if Matt is trying to come in or not?
He's not.
Oh, okay. He's not coming. Okay.
No, he said he'll come, but he's not here.
Yeah, because I can't see if he drops in.
No, I'll hear it if he drops in.
Okay. All right.
The reader will probably have noticed that Kautsky, in the passage from his pamphlet quoted above, speaks of an attempt to encroach upon universal suffrage, calling it, by the way, a deep source of mighty moral authority, whereas Engels, apropos of the same Paris Commune and the same question of dictatorship, spoke of the authority of the armed people against the bourgeoisie, a very characteristic difference between Philistines' and revolutionaries' view on the authority. Yeah, Engels is more for direct action. He thinks that proletariats should just pick up their guns and hold it. And Kautsky is talking about voting.
Harder. Vote harder.
Exactly. It should be observed that the question of depriving the exploiters of the franchise is a purely Russian question and not a question of the dictatorship of the proletariat in general. Had Kautsky, casting aside hypocrisy, entitled his pamphlet Against the Bolsheviks, the title would have corresponded to the contents of the pamphlet, and Kautsky would have been justified in speaking bluntly about the franchise. But Kautsky wanted to come out primarily as a theoretician. He called his pamphlet The Dictatorship of the Proletariat in general. He speaks about the Soviets and about Russia specifically only in the second part of the pamphlet, beginning with the 6th paragraph. The subject dealt with in the first part, from which I took the quotation, is democracy and dictatorship in general. In speaking about the franchise, Kautsky betrayed himself as an opponent of the Bolsheviks who does not care a brass farthing for theory. For theory, i.e., the reasoning about the general and not the nationally specific class foundations of democracy and dictatorship, ought to deal not with the specific questions such as the franchise, but with the general question of whether democracy can be preserved for the rich, for the exploiters in the historical period of the overthrow of the exploiters and the replacement of their state by the state of the exploited. And basically, when you have democracy for the rich, you can't have democracy for anyone else.
I feel like, too, that, like, Kautsky's doing that thing that, like, mainly right-wingers do, but I feel like centrists and liberals do it, too, is, like, trying to steal the term and repurpose it from what its meaning was. Like, Marx and Engels had a meaning for the dictatorship of the proletariat.
Yeah,
but he's naming this piece that, and then, like, saying, but we should just slowly get there.
Exactly. And the dictatorship of the proletariat means the will of the proletarian rules. Capital can never overrule what the proletarian want.
Yeah.
Which does not happen in the U.S. Check out all the you can't legislate fracking law. Like there's so much of that in the U.S. That is only the way a theoretician can present the question. We all know the example of the Paris Commune. We know all that was said by the founders of the Marxism in connection with it, in reference to it. On the basis of this material, I examined, for instance, the question of democracy and dictatorship in my pamphlet, The State and Revolution, written before the October Revolution. I did not say anything at all about restricting the franchise, and it must be said now that the question of restricting the franchise is a nationally specific and not a general question of the dictatorship. One must approach the question of restricting the franchise by studying the specific conditions of the Russian Revolution and the specific path of development. This will be done later on in this pamphlet. It would be a mistake, however, to guarantee in advance that the impending proletarian revolutions in Europe will all, or the majority of them, will necessarily be accompanied by the restriction of the franchise for the bourgeoisie. Well, most of them happened after World War II, and they were definitely restricting franchise for Nazi collaborators.
Mm-hmm.
It may be so. After the war and the experience of the Russian Revolution, it probably will be so, but it is not absolutely necessary for the exercise of the dictatorship. It is not an indispensable characteristic of the logical concept of dictatorship. It does not enter an indispensable condition in the historical and class concept of dictatorship. The indispensable characteristic, the necessary condition of a dictatorship, is the forcible suppression of the exploiters as a class, and consequently the infringement of pure democracy, i.e., equality in freedom in regard to that class. For example, if you need to say, if you like support a death squad, you can't own guns anymore. Those kind of restrictions, right?
Yeah.
In which countries and given what national features of capitalism, democracy for the exploiters will be in one or another form restricted, wholly or in part infringed upon. It's a question of the specific national features of this or that capitalism, of this or that revolution. The theoretical question is different. Is the dictatorship of the proletariat possible without infringing democracy in relation to the exploiting class? It is precisely this question, the only theoretically important and essential one, that Kautsky has evaded. He has quoted all sorts of passages from Marx and Engels, except those which bear on this question. How come you're very quiet, Janet?
Because I'm muted.
Oh, okay. That makes sense. Why are you muted?
I don't know. I was just muting in case I was disturbing.
No.
Okay. I'll unmute.
I would rather have you jump in with comments, but whatever. Okay.
Where were we?
Kautsky talks about anything you like, about everything that is acceptable to liberals and bourgeoisie Democrats, and does not go beyond their circle of ideas. Sounds like Chomsky.
Yeah.
But he does not talk about the main thing, namely the fact that without the proletariat, that the proletariat cannot achieve victory without breaking the resistance of the bourgeoisie, without forcibly suppressing its adversaries, and that where there is forcible suppression, where there is no freedom, there is of course no democracy. This Kautsky has not understood. We shall now examine the experience between the Russian Revolution and the divergence between the Soviet of Deputies and the Constituent Assembly, which led to the dissolution of the latter and the withdrawal of the franchise from the bourgeoisie. So basically, the Constituent Assembly was filled with bourgeoisie, and then they literally started enacting violence and killing the Soviets en masse, and then so Lenin had to dissolve it.
Yeah. So I mean, Kautsky ever? Trotsky was for the uprising at first, right? And then he wasn't.
Kautsky was a Menshevik until May of 1917.
All right, so he was always a Menshevik, where Trotsky pretended to be a Bolshevik.
Leon Trotsky was a Menshevik until May of 1917.
Oh, okay, all right. So I get what you're saying. He was always a Menshevik.
Yeah, but the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks are only relevant in Russia. Kautsky was the head of the German Social Democratic Party.
Oh yeah, I know what you're saying. I know. Okay. I had a brain fart. Sorry.
Soviets dare not become state organization. The Soviets are the Russian form of the proletarian dictatorship. If a Marxist theoretician writing a work on the dictatorship of the proletariat had really studied the subject and not merely repeated the petty bourgeoisie lamentations against dictatorship as Kautsky did, singing to Menshevik tunes, he would have given a general definition of dictatorship and would then have examined its particular national form, the Soviets. He would have given his critique of... Okay, let me actually check the comments since you're not really doing that. Okay, Privyet, Final Forest 80. Voting day is not a holiday either, and
yeah, they were bringing that up on when we were having the conversation about being exploited.
Yep. Okay. Okay, let's continue. Okay. As it goes without saying, nothing serious could be expected from Kautsky after his liberalistic interpretation of Marxist teaching on the dictatorship. In the manner in which he approached the question of what the Soviets are and the way he dealt with this question is highly characteristic. The Soviets, he says, recalling their rise in 1905, created the most all-embracing, umfassend form of proletarian organization, for it embraced all wage workers. In 1905, there were only local bodies. In 1917, they formed a national organization. The Soviet form of organization, Kautsky continues, already has a great and glorious history behind it, and it has still a mightier future before it, not in Russia alone. It appears that everywhere that the old methods of economic and political struggle of the proletariat are inadequate. Versagen, this German expression is somewhat stronger than inadequate and somewhat weaker than impotent. Against the gigantic economic and political forces which finance capital has at its disposal. These old methods cannot be discarded. They are still indispensable for normal times. But from time to time, tasks arise when they cannot cope with tasks that can be accomplished successfully only as a result of combination of all the political and economic instruments of force of the working class.
So Kautsky was perfectly fine with, that 1905.
He was fine with the Soviets as long as they were losing.
Yeah, like he was. Yeah, he felt like that was their trajectory. They should just keep with losing.
Being in Tsarist Russia and
exploited. Yeah, okay.
Then follows a reasoning on the mass strike and on trade union bureaucracy, which is no less necessary than the trade unions being useless for the purpose of directing the mighty mass battles that are more and more becoming a sign of the times. Thus, Kautsky concludes, the Soviet form of organization is one of the most important phenomena of our time. It promises to acquire decisive importance in the great decisive battles between capital and labor towards which we are marching. But are we entitled to demand more of the Soviets? The Bolsheviks, after the November Revolution, New Style, or October Revolution in our old style, 1917 secured in conjunction with the left socialist revolutionaries a majority in the Russian Soviet of worker deputies, and after the dispersion of the Constitution Assembly, they set out to transform the Soviets from a combat organization to one of class, as they had been up to then, into a state organization. They destroyed the democracy which the Russian people had won in March. What democracy? It was basically the cousin of the king. In the end, we also know that the West was planning on getting rid of Kerensky because he was a weak ass person who was not going to keep Russia in the war. So if they had kept Kerensky in and not had the October Revolution, Russia would have been like a third world colony of England, basically.
Yeah. Now, was that so? All right, Kautsky's looking at the time of the early 1900s, and prior, he's talking. This stuff is prior to the revolution. Kautsky's right. So he's using the Soviets, but were as a working force, were they really were they as strong as the unions that were coming out?
There were no unions in Tsarist Russia. So the Tsar forbade unions except for these Zubetov unions, which were these internal spy organizations that kind of basically sometimes got workers. Yeah. So there were no unions were banned in Tsarist Russia.
No, and I know that, but I'm just saying why is he using the Soviets there and not in Germany they were trying to unionize, right? Why isn't
in Germany that was the problem. In Germany there was very strong trade unions. So then these unions never united in order to form a Red Army to overthrow the aristocracy class.
Yeah, I guess I'm just trying to figure out why Kautsky feels like the Soviet in 1905, the Soviets were stronger than the trade unions.
There were no trade unions in Russia in 1905.
No trade unions in Germany.
There were, of course, because what the Soviets did in 1905 was they kind of got the Tsar to create a constitution. So they formed thousands and thousands of strikes and stuff, and then they halted everything, all the production. So then the British imperialists were like, oh my God, our mine profits, we need more profits from our mines. And then they kind of forced the Tsar to compromise. So the Soviets in 1905 were definitely more powerful than the trade unions in 1905 in Germany.
That's what I was trying to figure out. Okay. I think you're at the
okay. The revolution, in line with this, the Bolsheviks have ceased to call themselves the Social Democrats. They call themselves communists. Okay, they can call themselves whatever they want. Those who are familiar with Russian Menshevik literature will at once see how slavishly Kautsky copies Martov, Axelrod, Stein, and co. Yes, slavishly, because Kautsky ridiculously distorts the fact in order to pander to Menshevik prejudices. Kautsky did not take the trouble, for the instance, to ask his informant Stein of Berlin or Axelrod of Stockholm when the question of changing the name of Bolsheviks to communists and the significance of the Soviets as state organizations were first raised. Had Kautsky made this simple inquiry, he would not have penned these ludicrous lines, for both these questions were raised by the Bolsheviks in April 1917. For example, in my thesis of April 4th, 1917, i.e., long before the Revolution of October 1917, and of course, long before the dissolution of the Constituent Assembly in January 5th of 1918. But Kautsky's argument, which I have just quoted in full, represents the crux of the whole question of the Soviets. The crux is, should the Soviets aspire to become state organizations? In April of 1917, the Bolsheviks put forward the slogan, "All power to the Soviets." And at the Bolshevik Party conference held in the same month, they declared they were not satisfied with the bourgeoisie parliamentary republic, but demanded a workers' and peasant republic of the Paris Commune or the Soviet type. Or should the Soviets not strive for this? Refrain from taking power into their hands, refrain from becoming state organizations, and remain the combat organizations one of class, as Martov expressed it, embellishing by this innocent wish the fact that under Menshevik leadership, the Soviets were an instrument for the subjugation of the workers to the bourgeoisie. Kautsky slavishly repeats Martov's words, picks out fragments of the theoretical controversy between the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks, and uncritically and senselessly transplants them to the general theoretical and general European field. The result of such a hodgepodge as to provoke Homeric laughter in every class-conscious Russian worker had he read these arguments of Kautsky's. When we explain what the question at issue is, every worker in Europe, barring a handful of invertebrate social imperialists, would greet Kautsky with similar laughter. Kautsky has rendered Martov a backhanded service by developing his mistake into a glaring absurdity. Indeed, look at what Kautsky's argument amounts to. Soviets embrace all wage workers. The old methods of economic and political struggle of the proletariat are inadequate against finance capital. The Soviets have a great role to play in the future, and not only in Russia. They will play a decisive role in the great decisive battles between capital and labor in Europe, and that is what Kautsky says. Excellent. But won't the decisive battles between capital and labor decide which of the two classes assume state power? Nothing of the kind, heaven forbid. The Soviets, which embrace all the wage workers, must not become state organizations in the decisive battles? But what is the state? The state is nothing but a machine for the suppression of one class by another. So this is basically the same kind of thing that every idiotic Western anarchist, including Chomsky, does, is where they just want the workers to always be a rebellion. And the minute they win, like, they complain about them winning. And then they endlessly idolize losers like Rosa Luxemburg, Salvador Allende. I love Salvador Allende, but he's a loser. You know what I mean?
The huge confusion for me on this is Kautsky's talking about incrementalism, having a state and being incrementally getting rid of it.
Yeah.
But then there's the bitching about there being a state at all.
Yeah.
And so, how are people squaring that? If they're going, oh, we're going to talk about Kautsky, but okay, you're saying that we shouldn't have a state, but he's saying we should have a state and just do exactly what they've been doing.
I know. What Kautsky means is he doesn't want a worker state.
Exactly.
And they just don't.
That's what I don't get. That's what I don't get. How someone claiming to be an anarchist would not understand that. I get believe me, I don't want anyone ruling over me. I don't want, I don't want someone telling me what to do. So I understand not wanting a state, but if you logically think of it, you're either going to have the people run it, or you're going to have a handful of rich, powerful people run it. So which would you want?
Exactly. And a lot of times anarchists actually don't believe in the potential of revolution. They always think it's like a secret group of Jews or whatever running the state, and not really the workers. And that's always what they talk about, socialism being betrayed or some bullshit like that. Naomi Klein said the same thing about when she supported the Tiananmen Square, whatever was going on there. She was like, and it's no, that's not what is going on. Just because you do not believe that workers are not capable of running a state without there being a secret elite, it doesn't mean it's not real.
Yeah. And that's the whole thing. People have to, that's the whole thing that it doesn't, in my head, it doesn't I want to have control over what I say, what I do. And you're going to get that better if you're working with everyone around you, on the same level. You can't, you might be able to propel yourself up, but like, then you're just exploiting people. So what is it? Like, I don't, like, all these people want is they think that the people that they believe are in power, they believe should be in power. The ones that they're bitching about, they're saying, oh, but we can't we wouldn't be able to handle it unless it was like, little incrementals from a state.
Yeah, and that never happens incremental, because we look at what happened to Germany.
Mm-hmm.
And often in the West, like, because they just don't want anyone to see there's some alternative, they don't explain all the things. Like, I'm actually doing a video about the Tiananmen Square event, and I was looking up what the liberal and the opening up and reform in 1978 was, and it was actually started by a farming community. So the opening up and reform was that there were some commune lands, but then there was extra land. So some families were able to contract out this extra land, and as long as they met the minimum quota, they could keep the extra grains or whatever from this surplus land, or from this contracted land, and then sell it. But it was started as an experiment by like farmers, and then it was so successful that it went up the level of the Communist Party of China, and then implemented as a national strategy. And another one that I was looking for was Shenzhen Special Zone. So right across from Hong Kong, there's this area called something different back then, but right now it's called Shenzhen. So it went from like a fishing village to this like super high tech. You look up pictures, it looks like some sci-fi place that only exists in like a sci-fi movie. So they had special economic zones where different economic zones got to try out different things, and this was initiated from the people. But of course, Americans will always be like, oh no, it was like pushed down by the dictator of China. And it was not. There's actually proof that so then they experimented with it, and it turned out really well. So it was a way to attract like foreign investors who are going to invest in Hong Kong to make it more attractive. And within 20 years, they just before, when you look, this was just a poor fishing village and Hong Kong was modern and stuff. But now when you look at this, Hong Kong looks like a place from paradise. Parasite? That movie. The movie where people live in the basement.
Oh, yeah. I think it's Parasite.
Okay, right. A place from Parasite, and then there's some lots of dispute. And Shenzhen literally looks like a place from a sci-fi utopian movie.
Yeah. The difference, and then it's but even thinking about America, FDR put out these things, and
nope.
that all came from the people.
Unions did.
Civil rights. Oh, we passed civil. No, that was the people fighting for it. And you know what? That was actually 55
the Soviet Union, and that was also the Soviet Union had way more to do with the civil rights than anything domestically happened. So what was going on in 1960s was decolonization was going on. And the U.S. was trying to swoop into African countries to kind of exploit them. Well, and then the African leaders were like, wait a minute, you guys are racist as F. I can't manufacture consent for this BS. So and in fact, there's a highway. So there was a Ghanaian diplomat so there's a highway between New York and Washington, D.C. where UN diplomats would travel to get from the embassy to the UN headquarters. So on this highway, it's called Highway 55. There was a Ghanaian diplomat who was treated very racistly. So basically, they said it was whites only, and he was like, "Wait a minute, I'm a diplomat." Anyways, because he complained, the next day, Eisenhower and Nixon apologized and integrated along this highway as to not create an international incident.
It's ridiculous how anyone can think that the people are not the ones with the power. And there's so many people that don't believe that the people actually do have the power, because the people are the ones that can dictate this stuff. If we all just friggin' work together, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, that is true. In a dictatorship, the proletariat, yes, the people have the power. But I'm just saying that a lot of people misunderstand how the Civil Rights Bill actually happened, because there were particular conditions that the US needed to do. The first one is the fact that it was like a period of decolonization and flux, and the US businesses wanted to establish a presence in Africa. So they had to pretend not to be racist, at least, or show. So unfortunately, what I feel is that a lot of people who are doing the Black Lives Matter protests are looking at the civil rights protests without understanding the material conditions behind that led to change, and blindly aping it, which is just leading to a lot of people getting killed and nothing changing.
Yeah, because nothing is changing, because we don't have the power behind it, because it's almost like what you're saying is they needed this business, so that gave the people that. It wasn't even the people, it was like they changed conditions because of capital, not because of.
There were reasons for the protests. Obviously, without the protests, none of the civil rights bill wouldn't happen. But it was material conditions that were far different then, that no longer exists now, that allowed that impetus to happen, and people are not understanding that.
Yeah.
So then, like, being in public with signs is not enough to lead to change, and so many people in America don't understand that.
Yeah, not the protest and the vote harder is not going to change stuff.
Yeah, you have to look at the means of like how, like, all the production, the supply lines, what to see what inconveniences the bourgeoisie or those in power in order to get them to give you trinkets. Obviously, it's really, really, really hard, if not impossible, without, like, say, like another world war, in order to change the power structure within the imperial core.
Yeah. I mean, especially when you have a president that's going to tell an industry that's, famously dangerous to work for, that they can't protest. You know what I mean? Like,
which industry?
The railroad industry was told they couldn't.
Again?
No, that was like back in December, but they still can't. Like, I mean,
yeah.
With everything going on,
the Supreme Court just ruled that management can sue unions for loss of profits caused by strikes.
Yeah, the cement trucks that the drivers left the wet cement in them, so they hardened up, so they lost all those trucks.
Yeah. So this is like literally full Mussolini rule. Look, this is literally what Mussolini would do. Like, this is a Mussolini ruling, and people don't understand how bad it is.
Yep.
Okay. Now let's continue. So I don't understand. I forgot where we are.
Kautsky slavishly.
Oh no, we got that. Okay. Okay.
This is what Kautsky said.
Oh, okay, excellent. But the decisive battles. Okay, that's where we're talking about the decisive. Nothing of that, heaven forbid. The Soviets, which embrace all the wage workers, must not become. Okay, we got that. Thus, the oppressed class, the vanguard of all the working and exploited people in modern society, must strive towards the decisive battles between capital and labor, but must not touch the machines by which capital suppresses labor. So Kautsky is basically saying workers should be losers forever. Must valiantly fight, but then be losers that we can mourn over.
Yep.
It must not break up that machine. It must not make use of its all-embracing organization for suppressing the exploiters. Excellent, Mr. Kautsky, magnificent. We recognize the class struggle in the same way as all liberals recognize it, i.e., without the overthrow of the bourgeoisie. Be losers. This is where Kautsky's complete rupture with Marxism and with socialism becomes obvious. Actually, it is desertion to the camp of the bourgeoisie, who are prepared to concede everything except the transformation of the organizations of the class which they oppress into state organizations. Kautsky can no longer save his position of trying to reconcile everything and of getting away with all the profound contradictions with mere phrases. Kautsky either rejects the assumption of state power by the working class altogether, or he concedes that the working class may take over the old bourgeoisie state machine. But he will by no means concede that it must break it up, smash it, and replace it with the new proletarian machine. Whichever way Kautsky's arguments are interpreted or explained, his rupture with Marxism and his desertion to the bourgeoisie are obvious. Back in the Communist Manifesto, describing what sort of state the victorious working class need, Marx wrote, "The state, i.e. the proletariat organized as the ruling class, now we have a man who claims still to be a Marxist coming forward and declaring that the proletariat, fully organized and waging the decisive battle against capital, must not transform its class organization into a state organization." This is basically every single anarchist argument where they're like, yay, workers co-ops, but then workers controlling the apparatus of the state. Yet.
Yeah. It doesn't make any sense.
No, I mean, yeah, like, sure, you can have infinite co-ops, but then there's something greater than like owning your own co-op.
Yeah, you have. What we need to be on top. The workers need to be the power. And you can't have that with just unions or just co-ops or just like you're not getting it there.
Yes, you need the state apparatus.
Which I'm not saying don't support any of this stuff because like
no, I mean co-ops can be great depending on what they do and whether they have Polish slaves or not.
Like I don't mind supporting a protest or something like that, but it's like it's not, you can't figure that this is all that's going to get us to where we need to go.
Yeah. Nope. Kautsky can no longer save his position of trying to reconcile. Kautsky either rejects the assumption of state power by the working class altogether, or he concedes that the working class may take over the old bourgeoisie state machine. But he will by no means concede that it must break it up, smash it, and replace it by a new proletarian machine. Whichever way Kautsky's arguments are interpreted or explained, his rupture with Marxism and his desertion to the bourgeoisie are obvious. Back in the Communist Manifesto, describing what sort of state the victorious working class need, Marx wrote, "The state, i.e. the proletariat organized as the ruling class. Now we have a man who claims still to be a Marxist coming forward and declaring that the proletariat, fully organized and waging a decisive battle against capital, must not transform its class organizations into a state organization." Here, Kautsky has betrayed that superstitious belief in the state, which in Germany, as Engels wrote in 1891, has been carried over into the general thinking of the bourgeoisie and even many workers. Workers fight. Our Philistine agrees to this, as every bourgeoisie agrees, since workers are fighting all the same. And the only thing to do is to devise the means of blunting the edge of their sword. Yeah. Fight, but don't dare win. Even Lenin makes fun of that. Yeah. Don't destroy the state machine of the bourgeoisie. Don't replace the bourgeoisie state organization by the proletariat state organization. Whoever sincerely shared the Marxist view that the state is nothing but a machine for the suppression of one class by another, who has at all reflected upon this truth, could never have reached the absurd conclusion that the proletarian organizations capable of defeating finance capital must not transform themselves into state organizations. It was this point that betrayed the petty bourgeoisie, who believed that, after all is said and done, the state is something outside classes or above classes. Indeed, why should the proletariat, one class, be permitted to wage unremitting war on capital, which rules not only over the proletariat, but over the whole people, over the whole petty bourgeoisie, over all the peasants, yet this proletariat, this one class, is not to be permitted to transform its organizations into a state organization? Because the petty bourgeoisie is afraid of the class struggle and does not carry it to its logical conclusion, to its main object. Kautsky has gotten himself completely mixed up and has given himself away entirely. Mark you, he himself admits that Europe is heading for a decisive battle between capital and labor, and that the old methods of economic and political struggle of the proletariat are inadequate. But these old methods were precisely the utilitization of bourgeoisie democracy, and it therefore follows. But Kautsky is afraid to think of what follows.
Mm-hmm.
I wish he had, because what follows is so horrific. It's like so obvious that Kautsky's wrong.
Oh, yeah.
Therefore, it therefore follows that only a reactionary, an enemy of the working class, a henchman of the bourgeoisie, can now turn his face to the obsolete past, paint the charms of bourgeoisie democracy, and babble about pure democracy. Bourgeoisie democracy was progressive compared with medievalism, and it has to be utilized. But now it is not sufficient for the working class. Now we must look forward instead of backwards to replace the bourgeoisie democracy by the proletarian democracy. While the preparatory work for the Proletarian Revolution, the formation and the training of the proletarian army were possible and necessary within the framework of the bourgeoisie democratic state. Now that we have reached the stage of decisive battles, to confine the proletariat of this framework means betraying the cause of the proletariat, means being a renegade. And one more thing, speaking of Chomsky, he also like so like there were these unions. Anyone who knows about Solidarność in Poland understands why you cannot have these like stupid unions in a socialist state, because when the workers own the entire state apparatus, you don't need stupid unions, and the only thing it can be used is for coups. So Chomsky also criticized Lenin for getting rid of these stupid unions, but then it's like, why would anyone want their own Solidarność? You know what I mean?
Yeah. Like, so like there's no point to a union if you are the ones in power. Like you
own this whole state. Like do CEOs have unions in the US?
No, but because you don't need
collective bargaining when you have the whole state is your collective bargaining apparatus, which is much more powerful. It's a state with nuclear weapons, not yet, but eventually it'll have nuclear weapons. Like China has nuclear weapons. Like that China can represent the interests of the worker far better than any stupid union.
Yes.
Kautsky had made himself particularly ridiculous by repeating Martov's argument without noticing that in Martov's case, this argument was based on another argument which he, Kautsky, does not use. Martov said, and Kautsky repeats after him, that Russia is not yet ripe for socialism. So they thought that, like, because Marxist theory is that you have to have like super industrialized countries where you empty out all the rural population. So when you have like a 90% industrialization, then like the proletarian can just like merely turn their guns on the bourgeoisie and win. So Russia was not like that. Russia was like way backwards. It was like maybe 2% industrialized, 98%. It was just like feudalism.
Where was China at?
China was worse than Russia, but equivalent to Russia, or
yeah. So in that sense, like Marx might have been a little bit
wrong. Marx has always been wrong about this. So there has never been a socialist revolution in any even mildly industrialized country.
Yeah.
It's always the third world backwater country where you have like 90% illiteracy and whatnot.
Yep.
Okay, so anyways, so the Mensheviks were like, we have to wait about 50 years until Russia industrializes and then we can have our revolution. And then Lenin in Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, shows that that'll never happen, because if you're like one of the if you're the imperialized countries, the capitalists will keep it underdeveloped. Example, all of Africa, India, all the countries that haven't had a socialist revolution, look at where they are, but the same place they were during that time. And so Lenin's like, that is never going to happen. So you have to leapfrog, like you have to have the socialist revolution first and then do the industrial development.
Yeah, because you're putting too many fat cats in power if you industrialize first.
No, you'll never industrialize if you are a third world country, because the US, Canada, Britain won't let you industrialize. True. They bomb factories in Sudan, like chemical, like, so that'll never happen. That's what Lenin was trying to say in Imperialism, the highest stage. So.
Where are we at?
Oh, sorry. I get really.
Cannot outright Europe is not ripe for socialism in 1909. I think that's
okay. Which logically follows that it is too early to transform the Soviets from the organ of struggle into state organizations. Read. It is timely to transform the Soviets, with the assistance of the Menshevik leaders, into instruments for subjecting the workers to the imperialist bourgeoisie. Yeah, he's making fun of that. That's exactly what I said.
Yep.
Kautsky, however, cannot say outright that Europe is not ripe for socialism. In 1909, when he was not yet a renegade, he wrote that there was no reason to fear a premature revolution, that whoever had renounced a revolution for fear of defeat would have been a traitor. Kautsky does not dare renounce this outright. So we get to an absurdity which completely reveals the stupidity and cowardice of the petty bourgeoisie on the one hand. Europe is ripe for socialism and is heading towards a decisive battle between capital and labor. But on the other hand, combat organizations, i.e. organizations which grows and gains strength in combat, the organizations of the proletariat, the vanguard and the organizer, the leader of the oppressed, must not be transformed into a state organization. This sounds like he's saying only revolution for whites only or something like that. So yeah, no country outside, like, so even back in the even now, like, no country outside of Europe was industrialized, because that's how colonialism works and imperialism works. So to say that any country that does not have like 90% of its industrial population like as like urban proletariat is just pure racism. From the point of view of practical politics, the idea that the Soviets are necessary as combat organizations but must not be transformed into state organizations is infinitely more absurd than from the point of view of theory. Even in peacetime, when there is no revolutionary situation, the mass struggle of the workers against the capitalists, for instance, the mass strike, give rise to great bitterness on both sides, to fierce passions in the struggle, the bourgeoisie constantly insisting that they remain and mean to remain masters of their own house. In time of revolution, when political life reaches a boiling point, an organization like the Soviets, which embraces all workers in all branches of industries, all soldiers, and all working and poorest sections of the rural population, such an organization of its own accord, with the development of the struggle and by simple logic of attack and defense, comes inevitably to pose the question point blank. The attempt to take up a middle position and to reconcile the proletariat with the bourgeoisie is sheer stupidity and doomed to miserable failure. That is what happened in Russia to the preachings of Martovs and the other Mensheviks, and that will inevitably happen in Germany and other countries if the Soviets succeed in developing on a wide scale to manage to unite and strengthen. To say to the Soviets, fight, but don't take all the state power into your hands, don't become state organizations, is tantamount to preaching class collaboration and socialist peace between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. It is ridiculous to even think that such a position in the midst of fierce struggle could lead to anything but ignominious failure. But it is Kautsky's everlasting fate to sit between two stools. He pretends to disagree with the opportunists on everything in theory, but in practice he agrees with them on everything essential, i.e. everything pertaining to revolution.
Yeah.
Okay, let's look at the comments. Can you share some?
Yeah. All right, so we were talking about voting day. Okay, so then we came down. Okay, so you were saying I thought Trump was the fascist. This ruling happened under Biden. That was...
They're both quasi-fascistic parties, I guess.
I mean, I feel like it doesn't matter who we have.
Yeah, it's like, right, because the state apparatus is basically meant, as James Madison says, to protect those with property from those without. And it does it on a global scale. So it doesn't really, so as long as they can get power within the state apparatus, they'll be doing the same function, but albeit in different ways.
All right, needs to have a discussion. Richard Wolff needs to have a discussion with Esha about co-ops, among other things.
I would love to have a discussion, and I do admire his passion for co-ops, and they do have a place in this world, and I have nothing against Richard Wolff, but I do think that the co-ops are limited, but I do admire his passion.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a problem with. I mean, Richard Wolff,
he really likes co-ops.
He does. I mean, he's trade union co-op, like that whole thing. Like he always pushes towards that.
And he's like I said, he really knows what he's talking about with co-ops, and he's good at entryism for a lot of people who are kind of like frustrated at Google or whatever. So I have nothing bad to say about him, but I do find it a little limiting.
Yeah, like he's just getting people to a certain point, and he's not digging down deeper. Like, okay, we could do these co-ops and the trade unions as like band-aids now, but this is what we need to work towards. Is more what his line of should be.
Exactly.
Yeah. All right, so they're talking about.
Here, let me do it. So you can't share the comments on screen?
I can. I actually can't right now.
Okay. Let me do this.
Yeah.
Okay.
Today, USA would rather not have unions so they can pay less to build weapons cheaper for the war economy.
I dropped my microphone.
Uh-oh.
Give me 1 second.
Mic down. You can just hold it like a singer.
How do I hold it?
Take your time. Just get it together. Okay.
Got it. Okay, sorry. Okay, now the microphone is backwards. Okay, now I got it. Sorry about that.
Oh, and he also likes to talk about France, is what they're saying about the journal.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, I would say, I don't know. I mean, it's weird because like a lot of
the Soviet Union absolutely helped unions. So I read an article where the Soviet Union gives strike funds to this union in England. But the existence of the Soviet Union itself scared the bejesus out of a lot of the Americans, to the point where they gave a lot of concession. But the Soviet Union themselves like gave strike funds to British unions and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So yes.
I thought they did something for the IWW too at one point.
Oh yeah, they did a lot of good stuff. They gave strike funds for the IWW, helped with their defense when they got cracked down in the Palmer raids. So yes, they did infinitely good stuff for the unions. But having a union in a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie is essential to like making sure that you don't get your arms chopped off in a factory machine or whatever.
Okay, you need to move over towards your mic because you're now halfway off the screen.
Now?
Yes. Now you're back. Now you're
okay. Yeah.
So yeah.
I know he likes it. What's in France? Nothing. They still exploit 14 African countries by like stealing half of their federal reserve, and they still have the CFA franc kind. So whenever like people in France fight, they're just fighting to keep up the imperial exploitation and unbridled cruelty against Africans.
Yeah, and like right now they're just fighting for like austerity. They're fighting for their own pensions and stuff like that, not to like raise everyone up and stuff.
Yeah, I mean France basically. I have a video where Chirac says, "Without Africa, France would be a third world country." And that is absolutely true, because everything that France gets is from exploitation in Africa with the CFA zone. Yeah. So when French labor are like fighting for whatever little pension benefits or whatever, they are not opposing the France's unbridled exploitation of Africa that goes on even today.
Yeah. Yeah. So.
Okay. So anything else?
Over a little more.
I'm sorry. What?
Move over to your mic.
Okay. Now?
Yeah. You still can move over a little bit more, but.
Okay. Now?
Yes.
Okay, my floor is not even, so sometimes I fall off with the sliding chair.
Okay. No, I understand, because I had a really warped. I had a 270-year-old house I lived in, and the floor was like a roller coaster. So.
Yeah. Sometimes, like when I start sliding this way, I'm afraid that I'll just go boom.
So yeah. And off of this topic, I wanted to ask you about something, because I came across the Lenin piece called "The Three Sources in the Three Component Parts of Marxism," and I feel like that's actually a really good starter piece for someone that hasn't really read, like may have read Marx but is struggling with it, because he just explains. So like I was wondering what you think of that piece, because I think he explains it pretty well. Like,
yeah, as I always say, anything that Marx explains, Engels and Lenin do it better, so you might as well skip Marx, because Marx is better in his original German. So I always say the best piece is, of course, Engels' Conditions of the Working Class in 1845 and Conditions of the Working Class in England. So you understand there's a lot of liberal mythology of constant progress and whatnot. And that's not what happened. So in fact, the life for the working class actually became worse for people in England between the 1600s to the 1800s, because at least when they were like semi-feudal, They had big land areas where they could breathe fresh air and not drink toxic water, where they were so people don't understand that it's not always constant. Like, I don't know why, but people think there's like constant progress of the human condition for everyone, but that's not what happened.
Well, even the feminists will say, like the Marxists, that feminists will say that Marx missed the mark on that too, because women had more freedom then too, in a way, than they did under the capitalist system.
Yeah, definitely. When you're in exactly. So the capitalist system actually transformed the family. Like thousands of things happen. It happened really quickly, and unfortunately, like people's memories and histories are not enough. Like people, like libertarians always talk about property, but people don't realize. You should read our piece on historically called "The Tragedy of Private Property." That all through history there was no such thing as private property. There was always community property, because you only had like one cow or horse to like plow a lot of land, and all the peasants had to kind of work together in community property and together give their tribute to the Lord. So all these things, like so what people don't understand is that there's not constant progress. So then the effect of industrialization and how it rapidly changed everything, and it changed everything for the worse. That's the one. And then, of course, I would also recommend development of capitalism in Russia, because people don't understand what happened, like why people lived in feudalistic environments and how industrialization changed that life. So those two go to the fundamental foundations, where in the West, people just kind of have this like magic theory of like constant progress, and they don't understand why there's urbanization through industrialization, and what is the effect it has. What is the effect it has on the health of the worker and whatnot. So those are like, I always suggest doing that, just skipping Marx and then going back to Marx after you understand the basics of developmental economics.
Yeah, because I just came across this piece because I was looking up other stuff, and I came across the three sources, and I felt like it explained better exactly where Marx and Engels were looking at. And then like
they were looking at hundreds and hundreds of data like points. They were like doing very deep research of like exactly what happened in Liverpool, like all the changes. They looked at old records. They did the most deep research, and based on data they came to their theories.
Yeah, but this is on like ideology.
Like ideology is different.
So what, like where they were looking at, and there's a couple of pieces mentioned of Engels that he wrote, like the anti-Turing and the one.
Okay. So sorry. So now I understand. Okay. So basically, it's the development of the concept of dialectical materialism, and the anti-Turing is basically like he basically makes fun of a lot of the German philosophers for their idealism, where idealism is basically doing the Sam Harris thought experiments and not actually engaging in reality. And he thought that was a deficiency in German philosophers. Of course it was, because you can engage in masturbatory thought experiments, but you're not in connection with most people, and you're not relevant to them.
Yeah, I feel like I put off reading Engels, and I really feel like I need to read something.
Engels is hilarious. Engels is I'm like a big fan of Engels. He's hilarious. He's very mean, rude. He's a little bit like Lenin in a different way, with the more drier German humor. Engels is funnier than Marx always.
Yeah. So I think I'm gonna go back through and read some of that stuff too.
Yeah, we can do Engels nights too. Like, I love Conditions of the Working Class. We did On Authority before. And the anti-Turing, the German philosophy, all of Engels I just love it.
Yeah. We Need Critical Thinking is saying, who could drink more and hold their own, Marx or Engels?
Oh, clearly Engels. No, this is actually no. There's a really funny story about this, where Marx kind of where Marx kind of gets drunk, but then he's like hungover in the bar, and then Engels is like basically like talking with all the definitely Engels.
Yeah, and then Hannah was just saying, I can see the difference between idealism and materialism, broadly speaking. I couldn't look at that word, that's why I looked up, because I couldn't say it while I was looking at it. I don't know why, but I mean that's basically what it is. But
materialism is where you look at data, actual conditions, and then And then if you want to change society on a mass scale, you look at where to go next after you look at everything that has happened now to see where you are now. Then only then you can plot the course next. Idealism is just is basically okay. So the difference between idealism and materialism, and this is from Mao, is that when you have an extremely unequal society, the bourgeoisie are not actually are they trying to solve a problem? No, because society is built for them. They love it. They love having their hundreds of slaves. They love their vacation homes and whatnot. So what they're trying to do is give a justification for status quo. They're not trying to solve a problem.
Yeah.
But if you are a poor peasant with like barely enough to eat, you are trying to solve an actual problem. So you don't care about the justification for why society should remain status quo. In fact, you don't want it to be status quo.
No.
So materialism is actually looking at why you have this problem and then figuring out how to solve it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And this is from Mao, by the way.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, no, I just thought I just had come across like we've read a lot of Lenin pieces and stuff, and I try not I used to, in the last couple of years that we've been doing this, I like to wait until you bring up something. And so I wasn't really digging into Lenin, but I started like reading some Lenin, and then I'm like, oh, this piece seems like it would be a great precursor to, and you know where I found it? I found it in the Marx's collection. It was an opening. It was Lenin's piece in the opening of Marx's collection that I was looking through.
Interesting.
So, yeah, so they have this piece called The Three Sources.
I'm still bummed that last week. So I tried to go see Lenin's tomb with Ben Rubinstein in Moscow, and then so every day it's only open from 10 to 1, and then when we went there, the line was 3 hours long, and so it's like, oh.
You have to get there at like 8 in the morning or something.
Yeah, we were. We didn't get there at 8. So no Lenin. It was very. I was a little heartbroken that I didn't get to see Lenin, because each time I go to Moscow, I try to see him.
Yeah.
Who's sleeping, not dead.
He knew you were there.
I know.
He knew you tried.
Yeah. And then I went to Ulyanovsk, and oh my God, I went to Lenin's bedroom. I was like so fangirly. I took a selfie from Lenin's sister's mirror.
Yeah, you didn't show me that.
I tweeted it out.
All right, I'll have to.
I'll send it again.
Yeah, but I don't get all your. You know what? You never show up in my feed. Never, ever.
Weird. Okay.
And even when I search historically and like we follow each other, it never comes up for me. Like I literally have to type the @ and the little thing out.
Okay. Well, yeah. So it was a very interesting experience. So then I got to see this, like, okay. So there was a house where the Bolshevik headquarters was in Ulyanovsk, and so they had a secret room where they printed all the illegal literature, where they were. So until 1956, no one knew about the room was so well kept hidden that no one knew about it until like for about 40 years after the revolution. Yeah. And then what you see is that it's like a secret room, like it's like so there's a stairs here, and then here's one room, but then you have to walk on the ledge of these stairs to what looks like a wall, and then under the wall there's like a secret mechanism, and then when you push it open you go to the secret room. So no one, like, it's pretty hard to see, like, if you didn't know. And so they had their printer where they had to really put like typecast, and then they did this, and then and then they had all their illegal literature, and so it was very amazing to see how like they were really good at keeping secret. Like they were, my God, they were good. But I was impressed.
Yeah, I mean, for the fact that they win the revolution and it's still.
And well, no one figured it out for 56 until 1956. I was like, damn, they're good.
So yeah, do you want to read one more thing? Or
sure. What do we want to read?
Well, do you want to read? You want to read the next?
Yeah, let's do that. Okay, Matt said, sorry, I can't make the show. I got back. Okay, can I? Okay, I don't know if I'm okay. I got back and my idiot neighbor knocked my door off its hinges. So I was going through my place, doing inventory to make sure nothing was stolen. Just now catching my breath. Now photographing damages. Sorry, I can't make the show. He has a really weird neighbor.
He lives in a weird place.
Is that close to where? No, he lives in Worcester, right?
He's well, that's like central Mass, kind of like Springfield's like western, Worcester, and then Boston's the eastern side.
Okay, hold
so
on.
he's like central Mass.
Okay, the Constituent Assembly and the Soviet Republic. The question of the Constituent Assembly and its dispersal by the Bolsheviks is the crux of Kautsky's entire pamphlet. Also, Chomsky's stupid rant. And like I said, in 1989, and like I said, it was basically because back then anyone could be part of the Constituent Assembly, and then the Constituent Assembly went on a mass pogrom and like killed all the peasants in the most cruel, disgusting fashion. He constantly reverts to it, and the whole of his literary production of its ideological leader of the Second International is replete with innuendos to the effect that the Bolsheviks have destroyed democracy. So, when let's say that you are elected, okay, so in the actual fair election, these Bolsheviks would have like had a majority. But then Denikin and Kolchak and all these like psychos who were armed by the West went and killed these deputies that were the Bolsheviks. Like the violence around that time was unimaginable. Like killing them like by cutting off their arm and legs. In fact, when I was in Ulyanovsk, I read the story where one intelligentsia who was of the Bolsheviks actually paid one of the white guards to shoot him as opposed to killing him in a more brutal way.
Yeah. Jesus.
Yeah. And so when people are bribing you to be shot to death, like that's the bribe. So then Lenin was like, fuck this. We are not going to do the Constitutional Assembly when you guys are not playing by their rules. We are changing the rules. And so then like basically if you are basically engaging in the way he did the rules is if you are engaging in the violence against the Soviets, you can't be in the Constituent Assembly. And then all these liberals are like, because Lenin lost the Constituent Assembly, he dissolved it. But that was not what happened. It was because the bourgeoisie cheated by killing a lot of people en masse.
And then like if you think about like how they used to behead people, and then you could pay more to get a sharper blade come down.
Yeah.
Like the proletariat in France was a lot nicer using the guillotine. Like
exactly.
That was swift, and it didn't like you didn't have to hack away.
Yeah, exactly.
Like we're nicer in our.
Yeah, I mean the Bolsheviks just people shot people and that's it. They did not cut off peasants' breasts and like gang rape them or whatever.
Or have totally have like this. I don't know. It's just like a frenzy of like
orgy of violence. I mean, Kolchak had 40 concentration camps. In fact, there was this one thing where this is a guy from the State Department where like 3 people get sick, and then the solution of the White Army is to destroy the entire hospital of 600 people.
Yeah, but we're supposed to be civil.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He constantly reverts to it, and the whole of this literary production of the ideological leader of the Second International is replete with innuendos to the effect that the Bolsheviks have destroyed democracy. See one of the quotations from Kautsky above. The question is really an interesting and important one because the relationship between the bourgeoisie democracy and proletarian democracy here confronted the revolution in practical form. Let's see how our Marxist theoretician has dealt with the question. He quotes the thesis on the Constituent Assembly, written by me and published in Pravda, on December 26, 1917. One would think that no better evidence of Kautsky's serious approach to the subject, quoting as he does the documents, could be desired. But look how he quotes. He does not say that these were 19 of these theses.
Do you want me to read for a little bit?
No, I can do it. 9 of these. He does not say that they dealt with the relation between the ordinary bourgeoisie republic with the Constituent Assembly and the Soviet Republic, as well as with the history of the divergence in our revolution between the Constituent Assembly and the dictatorship of the proletariat. Kautsky ignores all that and simply tells the reader that 2 of them of the theses are particularly important. One stating that a split occurred among the socialist revolutionaries after the elections to the Constituent Assembly, but before it was convened. Kautsky does not mention that this was the 5th thesis. and the other that the Republic of Soviets is generally a higher democratic form than the Constituent Assembly, which Kautsky does not mention that this was the third thesis. So the Constituent Assembly is basically was the idea that, so after the Tsar abdicated, the Milyukovs, the Guchkovs, and the other 14 prime ministers that they each had each week all were like saying, hey, we're going to have a Constituent Assembly and have a constitutional republic or constitutional monarchy or whatever bullshit. But then, of course, they knew better than to have the Constitutional Assembly. So they were going to have it in July. Then they postponed it because the minute they had the Constituent Assembly, Russia was going to check out of World War I. And the British and Americans and the French were really not wanting that. So they were trying their best to prevent it. But then after the Bolsheviks won state power, suddenly they became pro-Constituents Assembly. I wonder why. Yeah. So then, like I said, but then, like, the way he changed it, any idiot could have been a Bolshevik. You just had to walk into the office and sign up. So it wasn't even that prohibitory. So hold on. Only from the third thesis does
yeah, that's where you are.
Does Kautsky quote a part in full, namely the following passage. The Republic of Soviets is not only a higher type of democratic institution as compared with the usual bourgeoisie republic crowned by a constitutional assembly, but it is the only form capable of securing the most painless transition to socialism. Kautsky omits the word usual and the introductory words of the thesis for the transition from the bourgeoisie to the socialist system or the dictatorship of the proletariat. After quoting these words, Kautsky with magnificent irony exclaims, it is a pity that this conclusion was arrived only after the Bolsheviks found themselves in the minority in the Constituent Assembly. Before that, no one had demanded it more vociferously than Lenin. This is literally what Kautsky says on page 31 of his book. It is positively a gem. Only a sycophant of the bourgeoisie would present the question in such a false way as to give the reader the impression that all that Bolsheviks talk about a higher type of state was an invention which saw light of day after they found themselves in the minority in the Constituent Assembly. Such an infamous lie could only have been uttered by a scoundrel who has sold himself to the bourgeoisie, or what is absolutely the same thing, who has placed his trust in Axelrod and is concealing the source of his information. For everyone knows that the very day of my arrival in Russia on April 4th, 1917, I publicly read my thesis in which I proclaimed the superiority of the Paris Commune type of state over the bourgeoisie parliamentary republic. Afterwards, I repeatedly stated this in print, as for instance in a pamphlet on political parties which was translated into English and published in January 1918 in the New York Evening Post. More than that, the conference of the Bolsheviks party held at the end of April 1917 adopted a resolution to the effect that a proletarian peasant republic and present republic was superior to a bourgeoisie parliamentary republic, and that our party would not be satisfied with the later, and the party program should be modified accordingly. In the face of these facts, what name can be given to Kautsky's trick of assuring his German readers that I had been vigorously demanding the convocation of the Constituent Assembly, and that I began to belittle the honor and dignity of the Constituent Assembly only after the Bolsheviks found themselves in the minority in it? How can one excuse such a trick? Incidentally, there are many Menshevik lies of this kind in Kautsky's pamphlet. It is a lampoon written by an embittered Menshevik, Lenin. By pleading that Kautsky did not know the facts, or if that is the case, why did he undertake to write about them? Or why did he not honestly announce that he was writing on the strength of information supplied by the Menshevik Stein and Axelrod and Co.? By pretending to be objective, Kautsky wants to conceal his role as the servants of the Mensheviks who are disgruntled because they have been defeated. This, however, is a mere trifle compared with what is to come. Let's assume that Kautsky would not or could not obtain his informants from his informants a translation of the Bolshevik resolutions and declaration of the question of whether Bolsheviks would be satisfied with the bourgeoisie parliamentary or democratic republic or not. Let's assume this, although it is incredible, but Kautsky directly mentions my thesis of December 26, 1917 on page 30 of his book. He does not know that these theses in full, or does he know only what is translated for him by the Steins and Axelrods and company? Kautsky quotes the third thesis on the fundamental question of whether the Bolsheviks, before the election to the Constituent Assembly, realized that a Soviet republic is superior to a bourgeoisie republic, and whether they told people that. But he keeps silent about the second thesis. The second thesis reads as follows. While demanding the convocation of a Constituent Assembly, the revolutionary social democracy has, ever since the beginning of the Revolution of 1917, repeatedly emphasized that a Republic of Soviets is a higher form of democracy than the usual bourgeoisie republic with a Constituent Assembly. In order to represent the Bolsheviks as unprincipled people, as revolutionary opportunists, also Chomsky does this. This is a term which Kautsky employs somewhere in his book, I forget in which connection. Mr. Kautsky has concealed from his German readers the fact that the thesis contained a direct response to repeated declarations. These are petty, miserable, and contemptible methods Mr. Kautsky employs. That is the way he has evaded the theoretical question. Is it not true that the bourgeoisie democratic parliamentary republic is inferior to the republic of the Paris Commune or Soviet type? This is the whole point, and Kautsky has evaded it. Kautsky has forgotten all that Marx has said in his analysis of the Paris Commune. He also has forgotten Engels' letters to Bebel of March 28, 1875, in which the same idea of Marx is formulated in a particularly lucid and comprehensible fashion. The Commune was no longer a state in the proper sense of the word. Here is the most prominent theoretician of the Second International in a special pamphlet, The Dictatorship of the Proletariat, specifically dealing with Russia, where the question of a form of state is higher than the democratic bourgeoisie republic, that has been raised directly and repeatedly by ignoring this very question. In what way does this differ, in fact, from the dissertation to the bourgeoisie camp? Let us observe in parentheses that in this respect, too, Kautsky is merely trailing after the Russian Mensheviks. Among the latter, there are any number of people who know all the quotations from Marx and Engels, yet not a single Menshevik from April to October of 1917 and from October of 1917 to October of 1918 has ever made a single attempt to examine the question of Paris Commune type of state. Plekhanov, too, has evaded this question. Evidently, he had to. Mm-hmm. As it goes without saying that to discuss the dispersal of the Constituent Assembly with people who call themselves socialists and Marxists, but who in fact desert to the bourgeoisie on the main question, the question of the Paris Commune type of state, would be casting pearls before swine. It would be sufficient to give the complete text of my thesis on the Constitution Assembly as an appendix to the present book. The reader will see that the question was presented on December 26, 1917, in light of the theory, history, and practical politics. If Kautsky has completely renounced Marxism as a theoretician, he might at least have examined the question of the struggle of the Soviets with the Constituent Assembly as a historian. We know that from many of Kautsky's works, he knew how to be a Marxist historian, and that such works of his will remain a permanent possession of the proletariat in spite of his subsequent apostasy. But on his question, even as a historian, turns his back on the truth, ignores well-known facts, and behaves like a sycophant. He wants to represent the Bolsheviks as being unprincipled and tells his readers that they try to mitigate the conflict with the Constitution Assembly before dispersing it. There is absolutely nothing wrong about it. We have nothing to recant. I give the thesis in full, and it can be said as clear can be. Gentlemen of the vacillating petty bourgeoisie entrenched in the Constituent Assembly, either reconciles yourself to the proletarian dictatorship, or else we shall defeat you by revolutionary means.
So I wonder if, you know how, like, you know, we read some pieces where, you know, they're older pieces from the early 1900s where Lenin is okay with Kautsky because he's talking about, you know, like Kautsky was talking about economics and, you know, at that time, whatever he was using Kautsky's numbers on things and stuff like that. But what was I getting at? So like when he's saying like Kautsky was like he knew he was a good historian, you know what I mean? But I'm wondering if Kautsky, if the fact that Lenin used Kautsky early on actually gave Kautsky a little more oomph.
No, it didn't.
Like, I mean, well, like, would people know him today if it wasn't for?
Lenin?
Like
No.
Jacobin.
Obviously, none of us would know who Kautsky was if Lenin didn't get so mad at
That's
him.
what I'm saying. Like,
But Lenin got mad at him because he was the head. So back then, before, okay, so if you were to ask anyone in 1916 which country is going to have its first socialist revolution in the world, everyone would have said Germany. So,
God bless you.
Because Kautsky was the head of the SDP party, he had such an outsized role in the whole thing. And in fact, even Chomsky in his stupid rant explains how we've forgotten all the mainstream Marxists because they lost, and we remember Lenin because he won. And yeah, that was basically it. Like, no one expected Russia to be the first. And so because Kautsky was considered the thought leader, he would get really mad at the fact that he betrayed the socialist revolution.
Yeah. Okay.
But that is how revolutionary proletariat will always behaved and always will behave towards the vacillating petty bourgeoisie. Kautsky adopts a formal standpoint on the question of the Constituent Assembly. My thesis clearly and repeatedly that the interests of the revolution are higher than the formal rights of the Constituent Assembly. Absolutely. So it's like whether or not somebody, like in the US, I've seen prosecutors argue that you should execute innocent people because they followed all the procedures. Like, so the idea is whether the procedure is more important or the end result.
Yeah, okay.
The formal democratic point of view is precisely the point of view of the bourgeoisie democrat who refuses to admit that the interests of the proletariat and the proletariat class struggle are supreme. And so, yeah, I would much rather end smallpox and eradicate. I would much rather eradicate smallpox and go from end illiteracy within like a few short years over following some stupid procedure set out by the Milyukovs.
Yes.
As a historian, Kautsky would not have been able to deny that bourgeoisie parliaments are organs of this or that class. But now, for the sordid purpose of renouncing revolution, Kautsky finds it necessary to forget his Marxism, and he refrains from putting the question, the organs of what class was the Constituent Assembly of Russia? Kautsky does not examine the concrete conditions. He does not want to face facts. He does not say a single word to his German readers about the fact that the thesis contained not only a theoretical elucidation of the question of the limited character of bourgeoisie democracy, theses 1 to 3, not only a description of the concrete conditions which determined the discrepancy between the party lists of candidates in the middle of October and the real states of affairs in December, thesis 4 to 6, and also a history of the class struggle and the Civil War in October to December of 1917. From this concrete history, we drew the conclusion, thesis 14, that the slogan, all power to the Constitution Assembly, in reality had become a slogan of the cadets and the Kaledin and their abettors. Kautsky, the historian, fails to see this. Kautsky, the historian, has never heard that universal suffrage sometimes produces petty bourgeoisie, sometimes reactionary and counter-reactionary parliaments. Kautsky, the Marxist historian, has never heard that forms of elections, the form of democracy is one thing, the class content of the given institution is another. The question of class content of the Constitution Assembly is directly put and answered in my thesis. Perhaps my answer is wrong. Nothing would have been more welcome to us than a Marxist criticism of our analysis by an outsider. Instead of writing utterly silly phrases, of which there are plenty in Kautsky's book, about somebody preventing criticism of Bolshevism, he ought to have set out and to make such a criticism. And yeah, the Bolsheviks literally did not even most of them could not even read, so they had absolutely no power to prevent anyone from criticizing them.
Yeah.
He does not even raise the question of a class analysis of the Soviets on the one hand and of the Constituent Assembly on the other. Therefore, it is impossible to argue, to debate with Kautsky. All we can do is demonstrate to the reader why Kautsky cannot be called anything but a renegade. The divergence between the Soviets and the Constituent Assembly has its history, which even a historian who does not share the point of view of the class struggle could not have ignored. Kautsky would not touch upon this actual history, because if you do, the bourgeoisie look horrible in that, and you can't, Kautsky has concluded from his German readers that the universally known fact, which only malignant Mensheviks now conceal, that the divergence between the Soviets and the general state, that is, bourgeoisie institutions, existed even under the rule of the Mensheviks. i.e. from the end of February of 19 to October 1917. Actually, Kautsky adopts a position of conciliation, compromise, and collaboration between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. However much Kautsky may repudiate this, it is a fact which is borne out by his whole pamphlet. To say that the Constituent Assembly should not have been dispersed is tantamount to saying the fight against the bourgeoisie should not have been fought to the finish, that the bourgeoisie should not have been overthrown, and the proletariat should have made peace with them. And in Russia, it just meant pure slavery for most, and When Kautsky kept quiet about the fact that the Mensheviks were engaged in this inglorious work between February and October of 1917 and did not achieve anything, that's because they kept on postponing the Constituent Assembly in order to appease the West. If it was possible to reconcile the bourgeoisie with the proletariat, why didn't the Mensheviks succeed in doing so? Why did the bourgeoisie stand aloof from the Soviets? Why did the Mensheviks call the Soviets revolutionary democracy and bourgeoisie the propertied elements? Kautsky has concealed from his German readers that it was the Mensheviks who, in the epoch of their rule, February to October of 1917, called the Soviets revolutionary democracy, thereby admitting their superiority over all other institutions. It is only by concealing this fact that Kautsky, the historian, made it appear that the divergence between the Soviets and the bourgeoisie has no history, that it arose instantaneously without cause, suddenly because of bad behavior of the Bolsheviks. Yet, in actual fact, it was more than 6 months and an enormous period of time in revolution experience of Mensheviks' compromise, of their attempts to reconcile the proletariat with the bourgeoisie, that convinced the people of the fruitlessness of these attempts and drove the proletariat away from the Mensheviks. Kautsky admits that the Soviets are an excellent combat organization of the proletariat and that they have a great future before them. But that being the case, Kautsky's position collapses like a house of cards, or like a dreams of a petty bourgeoisie, that the acute struggle between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie can be avoided. For a revolution is one continuous and moreover desperate struggle, and the proletariat is the vanguard class of all the oppressed, the focus and center of the aspirations of all the oppressed for their emancipation. Naturally, therefore, the Soviet, as the organ of the struggle of the oppressed people, reflected and expressed the moods and changes of opinions of these people ever so much more quickly, fully, and faithfully than any other institution. That, incidentally, is one of the reasons why Soviet democracy is the highest forms of democracy. The period between February 28th, Old Style, and October 25th, 1917, the Soviets managed to convene 2 all-Russia congresses of representatives of the overwhelming majority of the population of Russia. Of all the workers and soldiers, 70 to 80% of the peasants, not to mention a vast number of local uyezd, town, gubernia, and regional congresses. During this period, the bourgeoisie did not succeed in convening a single institution representing the majority, except the obvious sham and mockery called the Democratic Conference, which enraged the proletariat. That sounds like something Guaido would do. The Constituent Assembly reflected the same popular mood and the same political group as the first June All-Russia Congress of Soviets. By the time the Constituent Assembly was convened, January of 1918, the second and third Congresses of Soviets had met, both of which had demonstrated as clear could be that people had swung to the left, had become revolutionized and turned away from the Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries, and had passed over to the side of the Bolsheviks. That is, turned away from the petty bourgeoisie leadership and from the illusion that it was possible to reach a compromise with the bourgeoisie, and had joined the proletarian revolutionary struggle for the overthrow of the bourgeoisie. So even external history of the Soviets shows that the Constituent Assembly was a reactionary body and that dispersal was inevitable. But Kautsky sticks firmly to his slogan, "Let pure democracy prevail through the revolution and the bourgeoisie triumph over the proletariat. Fiat justia perit mundus." Latin for "let justice be done even though the world may perish." Here are the brief figures referring to the All-Russian Congress of the Soviets in the course of the history of the revolution. So what happens is that in June, there's only 13% of Bolsheviks. And then by July of 1918, there's 66%. But then the total number of delegates increases at each time who meet. So like in June of 1917, there's 760, but then it's like 1,164.
Yeah.
One glance at these figures is enough to understand why the defense of the Constituent Assembly and the talk like Kautsky's about the Bolsheviks not having the majority of the Russian population behind them is ridiculous. Yeah. Let me also mention one more fact is I think fighting a civil war or fighting a world war is a much higher form of citizen participation than just voting, right?
Yeah.
And Lenin got people to literally, with their hammer and sickles, fight 14 countries attacking at the same time. So if they were willing to fight another world war over this, it clearly means that he had majority support. Like, because when you get the majority to fight a bloody world war, which the Russian Civil War is not a civil war, but a world war, it is a much higher form of participation than going to a voting booth and saying yes, right?
Yes. I have to read one comment. This is from Twitch, though. Dmitry Yulianov is saying, turn to the stream, and the first word I hear is Kautsky. Must be reading some Lenin today. Every day. No, anytime that we're on, we're reading. Well, normally. Yeah. We've read some other stuff, but we've read
some Georgy Dimitrov and some Engels, but mostly Lenin.
We did a Stalin too one time.
Oh yeah, we did a Stalin. We did a few Stalins, but yeah.
So yes, that's lit with Lenin.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I thought that was funny because we were just saying, like, would Kautsky even be known if it wasn't for Lenin? You know,
absolutely not. I wouldn't know who he was.
So,
none of us would.
No.
But Lenin had good reason to be angry at Kautsky.
So the only, like, Lenin's never wrong except for the fact that he brought up Kautsky and now we still hear about him.
No, the only time you ever hear about Kautsky is from the stupid Jacobin articles that defend him.
I know. But
I don't even understand, like, what the purpose of these, like, Jacobin has at least, like, 2 pages worth of, like, shitty articles. And it's like, Lenin has already debunked all of this, you idiot. So it's like, what the hell is your loserism here? Like, can't they pick a different loser to admire?
Yeah, they just don't like communism, so they just, you know what I mean? Like, they will keep this Kautsky thing alive because of that, I guess.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, Hannah said, Chomsky, it took me 20 years to start being critical of Chomsky. Well, the thing about Chomsky is if you don't have a creepy memory like me, what he does is he often, like, does this kind of nuanced track cooking that backtracks what he says and pretends he didn't say it. Like when he was in 1992, when he was supporting the Yugoslavian war and accused the Serbs of doing genocide, and then made conspiracy theories about Russians with nuclear backpacks. In 2001, he kind of went back and was like, oh, no, and, like, repeated what Parenti had been saying for 10 years.
Yeah.
So then it's kind of hard because what he does is he will tell the truth when it is too late and 20 years after the fact when there is nothing to be done. He just won't do it when, like, okay, so to be against the Yugoslavian war in 2001 is nothing. Everyone should know that when you see the depleted uranium on Serbs, like, and all the horror and the murder and the deaths and genocide. Yeah, that's easy. But
he only says it when it's like safe, like it's already passed.
Yeah, exactly. In 1992 is where you're on the line, you get called a Milosevic lover or whatever other stupid things, or a genocide protector, whatever else. But that is when you can actually mobilize some kind of resistance against the war. So what he always does is he'll come out against the war after it's too late. And then he will, in boring, gross detail, explain every atrocity. So when you are not, so he's always looks back but never forward. So it's kind of hard to understand that unless you kind of have a memory of him, if that makes sense.
Cannabinated says it's easy to revise history when people were lied to.
Yeah. And I mean, like I said, Kautsky sorry, what am I doing this? Chomsky.
Because maybe they're the same person. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. Okay. Well, no, because Chomsky was born in 1928 and Kautsky died in 1944. So they cannot be reincarnations of each other.
Kautsky's a vampire and he really is Chomsky.
Yeah.
Kind of like how Kissinger is still alive.
Oh yeah, he's 100 years old. Oh my god. Okay. So yeah, well, like I said, Kautsky has Chomsky. Oh, by the way, Chomsky has like I said, he's an idealist, and he's not he even pretends to be too stupid to understand dialectical materialism. To which I always have to say, if illiterate peasants had no trouble understanding it, you as a linguistic professor should be able to understand it, or else like you're really stupid and we shouldn't listen to you. But so he is an idealist, and ultimately he's not very courageous. So even when he was quote unquote opposing the Vietnam War, he was opposed to acts of sabotage against the military. And it's like, so he's always like Kautsky in that he will verbalize some kind of quote unquote dissent, but when the time comes to use your hands and get into action, he won't do that.
Yeah. So I just I want to read what Dmitry Yulianov from Twitch said. Lenin is totally justified in mentioning Kautsky. When you find that one person who embodies the contradictions of your analysis, you make sure that motherfucker is known forever as the rat he is. So yeah, yeah, Dmitry. I wanted to read that because that was my response into what I said. So.
And I mean, he is, well, like I said, all you have to do is understand that he died in exile, penniless in the Netherlands. His wife died in Auschwitz.
Yeah.
So even like selling out to the bourgeoisie, like the bourgeoisie betrayed him. Like he gained absolutely nothing by being a sellout.
Yeah. I've been reading this book, and it's actually pretty interesting. It's taken me forever to get through it. It's called How You Hide an Empire.
Oh, I've heard about it. I heard it's not very well hidden, but continue.
No, I mean it's that's what I'm saying. It's kind of slow for me to get through, but he has like a lot of neat kind of stories, and you're talking about Kautsky's wife dying in
Auschwitz.
Auschwitz, but the guy who created he brings up the fact of like farming and how like the guy that created what was his last name, Fanon or something, that created like how to split the nitrates so that you could farm so that they
Fritz Haber.
Okay. And then like his wife was really smart, but his wife ends up killing herself over the fact that from that he created
Zyklon B.
The gas they used.
Zyklon B.
And then before that wasn't until after she killed himself over the chemical gas he created.
Oh, the gas they use in World War I where they kill people, right?
Yeah. And then he created that after she died, and then her whole family died from it. Like her whole family was killed in Germany
in the concentration camps.
Mm-hmm. With the Zyklon, with what her husband created.
Yeah. So yeah, but because of him, the nitrogen the weird nitrogen thing, we are able to feed way more people than we used to before. But yeah, but then they use that same chemical for the chemical weapon in World War I, and then Fritz Haber, I think is his name.
Haber, yeah, that sounds right. Fritz Haber. Yeah, so it's kind of like I said. I mean, he has some really interesting stories in there, so I like that. But like what you said, it's the writing of it. It's a little harder to like. You can't just sit down and read it all at once. It's taking me a little bit.
Yeah, I understand. I mean, like I said, the empire is not very well hidden, but people in the imperial core don't understand. Like they just think, Africa's magically poor. And they don't realize, it's because of the IMF, the World Bank, all the nonsense, like the war, like it's kept that way. And because capitalism relies on the exploitation of that labor and so on and so forth. And you can only get that kind of labor when you have it underdeveloped, or else like there's a lot of things where
and he describes the territory. He describes territories really well, because territories were kind of, and I didn't know this, like how the territories in the United States started off of mainland was actually because of farming. they wanted this place down in Peru had this island that was just all guano. It was all bird shit. And so they were using the guano and they were trying to sell it to the United States, but the United States didn't like it. So the United States threatened to go down there and just take the island. But this is like, I think Britain had some point with Peru at the time too. So the United States wanted to go down and take the island, and Peru's like, yeah, you don't even try that. So they, because it was like a Navy guy said that he would do it. And then they just started taking all those islands. They started taking all these islands that we now use as like, for our planes to land and stuff like that. So,
well, I once read an article about how basically because this U.S. captain felt disrespected, he just forcibly relocated everyone on the Falkland Islands that used to belong to Argentina. So yeah, in the 1800s, that was basically gunboat diplomacy. Boom, gun, leave.
Yeah. So it was, I mean, it's just like basically the United States outside of mainland started their imperialism, getting islands of bird shit.
Yep. Well, and then of course there's the Barbary. Basically, they were
the Barbary Coast. Yeah.
Yeah. Pirating and mostly pirating. Yeah. So a lot of these merchants were basically like high class pirates.
Someone's asking if we're talking about the island off of Australia. I think the island was off of Peru.
There's another island off of Australia that the U.S. definitely moved in and forcibly relocated everyone to build a military.
94 islands. That's how many they ended up with. 94 of these islands that were basically guano islands is what they called them, because they were just
bird shit islands.
Yeah. And so what is by the way, somewhat loosely related question, have either of you read the works by Tariq Ali, especially his work on Lenin?
No, I haven't, but I will look it up, and if you come back next week, I might be able to give you an opinion.
All right. Yeah, I'll look into it too. I have not. They probably wanted the guano. Yes, they needed the guano, so that was for the farming. So this ties into that Haber story about him splitting the nitrogen. So before that what they needed to use was they wanted to use guano. That was actually helping, because without the industrialization of farming, without that, the nitrate being able to be split, the estimate was like 2.4 billion people.
Yeah, like we couldn't all fit on this earth with all the food. There would be food for us, but yes, because of that. So that is the catch. Not the catch. That's the irony. And of course, obviously, separating nitrate is just like a random tool based on which class gets to use it. One becomes a way to grow food, and the other becomes a thing for mass extermination.
Yeah, and now like the guano islands, 94 of them. They're all over the world. And mostly Philippines, some down by like Cuba and stuff like that. So they had all these little islands, but it's like now it's akin to the fact that we have like 800 bases around the world. You know what I mean?
Like, and the other day they were like saying China's being aggressive by being in the South China Sea, and it's like, what the F are you doing there?
Once again, China in the China Sea is wrong. But the United States being there is right.
No, like today I read an article from one of the stupid about how China violated international law, and it's like, who made this fucking international law? You and Britain, and China was not a country back then. You guys did it without consulting most of the third world. So F your international law that you made up on your own.
Yeah. I mean, that's how I feel. Like, people are like, well, you gotta obey these laws that the United States has, and I'm like, I was born here and I didn't sign any contract that I wanted.
But then like when the US speaks of the international law, it's like, F you, because you did it in 1944 when most of us were still colonies. So you and England colluding does not make it like international law. It makes it your bullying.
Yeah, that all had to do with the pirating too, right? Like the international law of the 200 miles out or 100 miles out.
Whatever bullshit. Yeah, whatever bullshit you guys made up. When you do, there was no India and there is no China, which makes up like a big portion of the world, is not count. F you.
Alex Marquez said freedom of navigation exercises, I think they call them.
Yeah, that's basically where you go really close to somebody else's water with like weapons, and that is a form of bullying. Like, we can kill everyone in this like land. It's a threat. And yeah, China said no to their freedom of navigation exercises because that's just bullshit.
Mm-hmm.
Well, so I think if China and Russia can bring nuclear submarines off the coast of Washington D.C. while pretending to nuke it, which the U.S. and NATO did right here off the coast of St. Petersburg, where they pretended to nuke it, then maybe we can talk about freedom of navigation.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, I mean, it's Cannabinated saying gray areas of the laws are always, I mean, laws are.
There's nothing gray about this. This law is very clear, but I'm saying that this law is legitimate because, like I said, no African country existed. They were all colonized by different European countries.
Mhm.
India was still colonized by England. China was still going through a civil war. And then, so when these laws were made, it was not made with the consensus of every country in the world. It was literally US, Britain, and France, like basically trying to keep their colonies.
Yeah, you can't make an international law. I mean,
When it's just
you as
US,
state
Britain, and
cannot
France.
make an international law. I mean, like the G7 can decide to make laws for those 7, or EU can decide to make laws for them, but you can't decide to make laws for everybody.
Yeah. So it's now, back then the thing was that there's like a big discrepancy, like and so China now has nukes and has more superior weapons to the US, so they're not willing to. They're like now just showing. Oh, actually, there's a really funny thing. So I don't know why the some Canadian fighter plane was flying really close to the DPRK. They have absolutely no reason to fly that close. Anyways, this Chinese pilot came really close to him and gave him the middle finger, and then Canada flew away because they knew that they couldn't like really go on a combat with China there.
Yeah.
But for a long time, China was not willing to literally give Canada the middle finger, which it is now. And this offends the ruling class because they don't like it when non-white people give them the middle finger.
They're
They like what?
They're supposed to be civil.
Yeah, non-white people are supposed to be civil, while white people can like kill everything that moves.
Yeah.
So now they're making a big deal out of it because it offends them.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know if there's any more. No, I think we went.
Taiwan Strait. Yeah, the Taiwan Strait. Oh, and then with Indonesia, there's a Malaga Strait, which the U.S. does these whatever bullshit like intimidation exercises too, and yeah. And like in 2015, I'm sorry, what?
The U.S. is gonna FAFO.
What's a FAFO?
Fuck around and find out.
Exactly. With China, they're totally gonna FAFO. Because and I mean, Iran is also not taking so in the Persian Gulf, there's what's that strait called? Hormuz. The Strait of Hormuz is this little area where, like, basically the U.S. needs to access to the Strait of Hormuz to get oil from its oil buddies, and so it's between like the Arabic Peninsula and Persia, and so the U.S. has before literally looted oil from Persian ships and whatnot. So then Iran's been now kind of like, F you, we're not letting you do that anymore.
I don't like the disrespect the Chinese are giving to the America Junior joke. That was yipper.
Just kidding, I think.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, that is basically the whole offense of the thing. And yeah, I mean, if the U.S. wanted to be like industrially competitive and spent money on it and stuff like that, there's nothing that stopped them. It's just that they refused because they got really cocky after the fall of the Soviet Union and thought they could coup China. And yeah.
And we talked to someone that is here in the United States and was saying that she sees the ramp up of the Chinese, like the xenophobia and stuff, and just putting out those articles saying like, oh, China was doing this, and And so the Americans are going to sit there and think, oh, China's starting the war with us. Like,
yeah.
Not think, okay, why, not like logically think, why is the US over there doing that? You know what I mean? Like, why
Exactly.
these maneuvers? But like, no, they'll just go, oh my God, China is like being horrible. They're, they're giving the finger to Canada.
Everyone should give the finger to Canada.
They're not scared of us in their waters.
Yeah.
How horrible is China? It's just ridiculous. It's so ridiculous.
Exactly. And of course the worst impact is Asian Americans. Probably like some random Cambodian American is going to get beaten up by some racist.
Oh yeah, when you two were talking about that, and it was like, all I could think of is like she was saying xenophobia against Chinese, but like she also said Asian too. But it's like there was the point that like most Americans cannot tell the difference between who's Chinese, Japanese, Korean. Like they can't tell that stuff. Even after 9/11, like I remember, like they were going after some
Indians.
Yeah, Indians and stuff like that. Like
and the Sikh temples got shot up, and it's like that's the so it's not like the anti-China propaganda is going to stay just for Chinese Americans. It's going to threaten everyone who doesn't look white, basically.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, it's like an article that shows how dare Russia shoot down a U.S. drone in the Black Sea, and yes, like what the F is a U.S. drone doing in the Black Sea? But once I saw this really ridiculous CNN article where it says that Russia is flying its planes 100 miles off the coast of Alaska. In other words, in Russia.
In Russia, yeah.
I mean, like Russia can fly their planes in Russia.
How like it's less than 100 miles, isn't it? Like there's one part that's like they're only like 80 miles apart.
Yeah. Okay, it's basically Russia was literally flying a plane in Russia. So, and it's like, you always get this, like, and it's because,
Hannah says the West has such a long game with China over the centuries. I don't know, when did everything begin with the China stuff?
I think the Opium Wars.
Yeah, that was more like the English really started with China first.
Yeah. Well, so what happened is that so the Spanish, like when they came to South America, there was a lot of silver, and China was like also had natural silver, so they didn't China, like the West didn't really have anything that China would want to trade with. So then they check out our episode with Carl Za, of course, on historically.net. But then China, basically opium was what was introduced in order to deplete China of its silver. And through the Opium Wars, did England acquire these coastal towns as like colonies to like let them like control China. Mm-hmm. And so, that was what Chinese referred to as a century of humiliation, because it turned the majority of the population into opium addicts. And then because they were growing opium, they couldn't grow things like rice. It took away their food sovereignty. It just impoverished them and made them all miserable. So, but for the Western point of view, they like all that exploitation. And so when the China became independent, they are missing the old relationship of China being the opium colony. And it's like, it's hard for them to handle that.
And it's
Hong
sad.
Kong was just one of them. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, that someone brought up the fact they've talked about building the bridge between like Alaska and Russia. Like I heard that when I was a kid and stuff like that. Like people discuss it, and it's pretty sad because it would be pretty neat because you could actually like drive
to Russia.
But we have to have this hostility towards them and stuff like that and whatever.
Oh, I'm confusing imperialism and open market. No. Open markets don't exist. Markets don't exist in nature. All open whatever market is made by people, and these rules of the market are influence to help certain people over another. So, so it's just bullshit. So you have to look at all the conditions and whatnot and what they allow, what they privatize, and so on, because markets do not exist in nature.
Yeah. So, I don't know. Anything else?
No, I guess not. I may be going to a place. I might be going to the Donbass region next week, so I'm not 100% sure about that. So if I'm in a war zone, I guess I can't be doing Lates with Lenin.
I'll keep people apprised on historically.
Maybe I could record one before I go it and or something like that.
Yeah, well, yeah, you just let me know, and then maybe we can.
Yeah. Okay.
Get
yeah,
together.
We could record. Yeah, depending on how long I go. But yeah, so with that, I will say Svobodu Narodu Smrti Fascismu. Subscribe. Please go to historically.net and subscribe. Be sure to hit like and all that, and please donate money.
And Yipper says stay safe, which is what I first said when she told me.
I will try to stay as safe as possible.
All right. You better.
Bye-bye.
Bye.